My Inventions, Part 6, The Art of Telautomatics by Nikola Tesla. This article was published in Electrical Experimenter, October 1919. No subject to which I have ever devoted myself has called for such concentration of mind and strained to so dangerous a degree the finest fibers of my brain as the system of which the magnifying transmitter is the foundation. I put all the intensity and vigor of youth in the development of the rotating field discoveries, but those early labors were of a different character. Although strenuous in the extreme, they did not involve that keen and exhausting discernment which had to be exercised in attacking the many puzzling problems of the wireless. Despite my rare physical endurance at that period, the abused nerves finally rebelled, and I suffered a complete collapse, just as the consummation of the long and difficult task was almost in sight. Without doubt I would have paid a greater penalty later, and very likely my career would have been prematurely terminated, had not Providence equipped me with a safety device, which has seemed to improve with advancing years, and unfailingly comes into play when my forces are at an end. So long as it operates, I am safe from danger due to overwork, which threatens other inventors, and, incidentally, I need no vacations which are indispensable to most people. When I am all but used up, I simply do as the darkies, who naturally fall asleep while white folks worry. To venture a theory out of my sphere, the body probably accumulates little by little a definite quantity of some toxic agent, and I sink into a nearly lethargic state which lasts half an hour to the minute. Upon awakening, I have the sensation as though the events immediately preceding had occurred very long ago, and if I attempt to continue the interrupted train of thought, I feel a veritable mental nausea. Involuntarily, I then turn to other work, and am surprised at the freshness of the mind and ease with which I overcome obstacles that had baffled me before. After weeks or months, my passion for the temporarily abandoned invention returns, and I invariably find answers to all the vexing questions with scarcely any effort. In this connection I will tell of an extraordinary experience which may be of interest to students of psychology. I had produced a striking phenomenon with my grounded transmitter, and was endeavoring to ascertain its true significance in relation to the currents propagated through the earth. It seemed a hopeless undertaking, and for more than a year I worked unremittingly, but in vain. This profound study so entirely absorbed me that I became forgetful of everything else, even of my undermined health. At last, as I was at the point of breaking down, nature applied the preservative-inducing lethal sleep. Regaining my senses, I realized with consternation that I was unable to visualize scenes of my life except those of the infancy, the very first ones that had entered my consciousness. Curiously enough, these appeared before my vision with startling distinctness and afforded me welcome relief. Night after night, when retiring, I would think of them, and more of my previous existence was revealed. The image of my mother was always the principal figure in the spectacle that slowly unfolded, and a consuming desire to see her again gradually took possession of me. This feeling grew so strong that I resolved to drop all work and satisfy my longing. But I found it too hard to break away from the laboratory, and several months elapsed during which I had succeeded in reviving all the impressions of my past life up to the spring of 1892. In the next picture that came out of the mist of oblivion, I saw myself at the Hôtel de la Paix in Paris, just coming to from one of my peculiar sleeping spells, which had been caused by prolonged exertion of the brain. Imagine the pain and distress I felt when it flashed upon my mind that a dispatch was handed to me at that very moment, bearing the sad news that my mother was dying. I remembered how I made the long journey home without an hour of rest, and how she passed away after weeks of agony. It was especially remarkable that during all this period of partially obliterated memory, I was fully alive to everything touching on the subject of my research. I could recall the smallest details and the least insignificant observations in my experiments, and even recite pages of text and complex mathematical formulae. My belief is firm in a law of compensation. The true rewards are ever in proportion to the labor and sacrifices made. This is one of the reasons why I feel certain that of all my inventions, the magnifying transmitter will prove most important and valuable to future generations. I am prompted to this prediction not so much by thoughts of the commercial and industrial revolution, which it will surely bring about, but of the humanitarian consequences of the many achievements it makes possible. Considerations of mere utility weigh little in the balance against the higher benefits of civilization. We are confronted with portentous problems which cannot be solved just by providing for our material existence, however abundantly. On the contrary, progress in this direction is fraught with hazards and perils not less menacing than those born from want and suffering. If we were to release the energy of atoms, or discover some other way of developing cheap and unlimited power at any point of the globe, this accomplishment, instead of being a blessing, might bring disaster to mankind in giving rise to dissension and anarchy, which would ultimately result in the enthronement of the hated regime of force. The greatest good will come from technical improvements tending to unification and harmony, and my wireless transmitter is preeminently such. By its means, the human voice and likeness will be reproduced everywhere, and factories driven thousands of miles from waterfalls furnishing the power. Aerial machines will be propelled around the earth without a stop, and the sun's energy controlled to create lakes and rivers for motive purposes and transformation of arid deserts into fertile land. Its introduction for telegraphic, telephonic, and similar uses will automatically cut out the statics and all other interferences which at present impose narrow limits to the application of the wireless. This is a timely topic on which a few words might not be amiss. Tesla raps static men vigorously. During the past decade, a number of people have arrogantly claimed that they had succeeded in doing away with this impediment. I have carefully examined all of the arrangements described and tested most of them, long before they were publicly disclosed, but the finding was uniformly negative. A recent official statement from the U.S. Navy may, perhaps, have taught some beguilable news editors how to appraise these announcements at their real worth. As a rule, the attempts are based on theories so fallacious that whenever they come to my notice, I cannot help thinking in a lighter vein. Quite recently, a new discovery was heralded with a deafening flourish of trumpets, but it provided another case of a mountain bringing forth a mouse. This reminds me of an exciting incident which took place years ago when I was conducting my experiments with currents of high frequency. Steve Brodie had just jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge. The feat has been vulgarized since by imitators, but the first report electrified New York. I was very impressionable then and frequently spoke of the daring printer. On a hot afternoon, I felt the necessity of refreshing myself and stepped into one of the popular 30,000 institutions of this great city, where a delicious 12% beverage was served, which can now be had only by making a trip to the poor and devastated countries of Europe. The attendance was large and not over-distinguished, and a matter was discussed which gave me an admirable opening for the careless remark, "This is what I said when I jumped off the bridge." No sooner had I uttered these words than I felt like the companion of Timotheus in the poem of Schiller. In an instant there was a pandemonium, and a dozen voices cried, "It is Brodie!" I threw a quarter on the counter and bolted for the door, but the crowd was at my heels with yells, "Stop, Steve!" which must have been misunderstood, for many persons tried to hold me up as I ran frantically for my haven of refuge. By darting around corners I fortunately managed, through the medium of a fire escape, to reach the laboratory, where I threw off my coat, camouflaged myself as a hard-working blacksmith, and started the forge. But these precautions proved unnecessary. I had eluded my pursuers. For many years afterward, at night, when imagination turns into spectres the trifling troubles of the day, I often thought, as I tossed on the bed, what my fate would have been had that mob caught me and found out that I was not Steve Brodie. Now, the engineer who lately gave an account before a technical body of a novel remedy against statics based on a heretofore unknown law of nature seems to have been as reckless as myself when he contended that these disturbances propagate up and down, while those of a transmitter proceed along the earth. It would mean that a condenser, as this globe, with its gaseous envelope, could be charged and discharged in a manner quite contrary to the fundamental teachings propounded in every elementary textbook of physics. Such a supposition would have been condemned as erroneous, even in Franklin's time, for the facts bearing on this were then well known, and the identity between atmospheric electricity and that developed by machines was fully established. Obviously, natural and artificial disturbances propagate through the earth and the air in exactly the same way, and both set up electromotive forces in the horizontal as well as vertical sense. Interference cannot be overcome by any such methods as were proposed. The truth is this. In the air, the potential increases at the rate of about 50 volts per foot of elevation, owing to which there may be a difference of pressure amounting to 20 or even 40,000 volts between the upper and lower ends of the antenna. The masses of the charged atmosphere are constantly in motion and give up electricity to the conductor, not continuously, but rather disruptively, this producing a grinding noise in a sensitive telephonic receiver. The higher the terminal and the greater the space encompassed by the wires, the more pronounced is the effect, but it must be understood that it is purely local and has little to do with the real trouble. In 1900, while perfecting my wireless system, one form of apparatus comprised 4 antennae. These were carefully calibrated to the same frequency and connected in multiple with the object of magnifying the action in receiving from any direction. When I desired to ascertain the origin of the transmitted impulses, each diagonally situated pair was put in series with a primary coil energizing the detector circuit. In the former case, the sound was loud in the telephone. In the latter, it ceased, as expected, the 2 antennae neutralizing each other. But the true statics manifested themselves in both instances, and I had to devise special preventatives embodying different principles. The remedy for static. By employing receivers connected to 2 points of the ground, as suggested by me long ago, this trouble caused by the charged air, which is very serious in the structures as now built, is nullified, and besides, the liability of all kinds of interferences is reduced to about 1/2 because of the directional character of the circuit. This was perfectly self-evident, but came as a revelation to some simple-minded wireless folks whose experience was confined to forms of apparatus that could have been improved with an axe, and they have been disposing of the bear's skin before killing him. If it were true that strays performed such antics, it would be easy to get rid of them by receiving without aerials. But, as a matter of fact, a wire buried in the ground, which, conforming to this view, should be absolutely immune, is more susceptible to certain extraneous impulses than one placed vertically in the air. To state it fairly, a slight progress has been made, but not by virtue of any particular method or device. It was achieved simply by discarding the enormous structures, which are bad enough for transmission, but wholly unsuitable for reception, and adopting a more appropriate type of receiver. As I pointed out in a previous article, to dispose of this difficulty for good, a radical change must be made in the system, and the sooner this is done, the better. Radio government control not wanted. It would be calamitous indeed if at this time, when the art is in its infancy, and the vast majority, not excepting even experts, have no conception of its ultimate possibilities, a measure would be rushed through the legislature, making it a government monopoly. This was proposed a few weeks ago by Secretary Daniels, and no doubt that distinguished official has made his appeal to the Senate and House of Representatives with sincere conviction. But universal evidence unmistakably shows that the best results are always obtained in healthful commercial competition. There are, however, exceptional reasons why wireless should be given the fullest freedom of development. In the first place, it offers prospects immeasurably greater and more vital to betterment of human life than any other invention or discovery in the history of man. Then again, it must be understood that this wonderful art has been, in its entirety, evolved here, and can be called American with more right and propriety than the telephone, the incandescent lamp, or the aeroplane. Enterprising press agents and stock jobbers have been so successful in spreading misinformation that even so excellent a periodical as the Scientific American accords the chief credit to a foreign country. The Germans, of course, gave us the Hertz waves, and the Russian, English, French, and Italian experts were quick in using them for signaling purposes. It was an obvious application of the new agent, and accomplished with the old classical and unimproved induction coil, scarcely anything more than another kind of heliography. The radius of transmission was very limited, the results attained of little value, and the Hertz oscillations, as a means for conveying intelligence, could have been advantageously replaced by sound waves, which I advocated in 1891. Moreover, all of these attempts were made 3 years after the basic principles of the wireless system, which is universally employed today, and its potent instrumentalities had been clearly described and developed in America. No trace of those Hertzian appliances and methods remains today. We have proceeded in the very opposite direction, and what has been done is the product of the brains and efforts of citizens of this country. The fundamental patents have expired, and the opportunities are open to all. The chief argument of the Secretary is based on interference. According to his statement, reported in the New York Herald of July 29th, signals from a powerful station can be intercepted in every village of the world. In view of this fact, which was demonstrated in my experiments of 1900, it would be of little use to impose restrictions in the United States. America first. As throwing light on this point, I may mention that only recently an odd-looking gentleman called on me with the object of enlisting my services in the construction of world transmitters in some distant land. "We have no money," he said, "but carloads of solid gold, and we will give you a liberal amount." I told him that I wanted to see first what will be done with my inventions in America, and this ended the interview. But I am satisfied that some dark forces are at work, and as time goes on, the maintenance of continuous communication will be rendered more difficult. The only remedy is a system immune against interruption. It has been perfected, it exists, and all that is necessary is to put it in operation. The terrible conflict is still uppermost in the minds, and perhaps the greatest importance will be attached to the magnifying transmitter as a machine for attack and defense, more particularly in connection with Telautomatics. This invention is a logical outcome of observations begun in my boyhood and continued throughout my life. When the first results were published, the Electrical Review started editorially that it would become one of the most potent factors in the advance and civilization of mankind. The time is not distant when this prediction will be fulfilled. In 1898 and 1900 it was offered to the government, and might have been adopted, were I one of those who would go to Alexander's shepherd when they want a favor from Alexander. At that time, I really thought that it would abolish war, because of its unlimited destructiveness and exclusion of the personal element of combat. But while I have not lost faith in its potentialities, my views have changed since. The road to permanent peace. War cannot be avoided until the physical cause for its recurrence is removed, and this, in the last analysis, is the vast extent of the planet on which we live. Only through annihilation of distance in every respect, as the conveyance of intelligence, transport of passengers and supplies, and transmission of energy, will conditions be brought about some day, ensuring permanency of friendly relations. What we now want most is closer contact and better understanding between individuals and communities all over the earth, and the elimination of that fanatic devotion to exalted ideals of national egoism and pride, which is always prone to plunge the world into primeval barbarism and strife. No league or parliamentary act of any kind will ever prevent such a calamity. These are only new devices for putting the weak at the mercy of the strong. I have expressed myself in this regard 14 years ago, when a combination of a few leading governments, a sort of holy alliance, was advocated by the late Andrew Carnegie, who may be fairly considered as the father of this idea, having given to it more publicity and impetus than anybody else prior to the efforts of the President. While it cannot be denied that such a pact might be of material advantage to some less fortunate peoples, it cannot attain the chief object sought. Peace can only come as a natural consequence of universal enlightenment and merging of races, and we are still far from this blissful realization. As I view the world of today, in the light of the gigantic struggle we have witnessed, I am filled with conviction that the interests of humanity would be best served if the United States remained true to its traditions and kept out of entangling alliances. Situated as it is, geographically, remote from the theaters of impending conflicts, without incentive to territorial aggrandizement, with inexhaustible resources and immense population thoroughly imbued with the spirit of liberty and right, this country is placed in a unique and privileged position. It is thus able to exert, independently, its colossal strength and moral force to the benefit of all, more judiciously and effectively than as a member of a league. The mechanistic theory of life. In one of these biographical sketches, published in the Electrical Experimenter, I have dwelt on the circumstances of my early life and told of an affliction which compelled me to unremitting exercise of imagination and self-observation. This mental activity, at first involuntary under the pressure of illness and suffering, gradually became second nature and led me finally to recognize that I was but an automaton devoid of free will in thought and action, and merely responsive to the forces of the environment. Our bodies are of such complexity of structure, the motions we perform are so numerous and involved, and the external impressions on our sense organs to such a degree delicate and elusive, that it is hard for the average person to grasp this fact. And yet nothing is more convincing to the trained investigator than the mechanistic theory of life which had been, in a measure, understood and propounded by Descartes 300 years ago. But in this time many important functions of our organism were unknown, and, especially with respect to the nature of light and the construction and operation of the eye, philosophers were in the dark. In recent years, the progress of scientific research in these fields has been such as to leave no room for a doubt in regard to this view, on which many works have been published. One of its ablest and most eloquent exponents is, perhaps, Félix Le Dantec, formerly assistant of Pasteur. Professor Jacques Loeb has performed remarkable experiments in heliotropism, clearly establishing the controlling power of light in lower forms of organisms, and his latest book, Forced Movements, is revelatory. But while men of science accept this theory simply as any other that is recognized, to me it is a truth which I hourly demonstrate by every act and thought of mine. The consciousness of the external impression prompting me to any kind of exertion, physical or mental, is ever present in my mind. Only on very rare occasions, when I was in a state of exceptional concentration, have I found difficulty in locating the original impulses. Lack of observation a form of ignorance. The by far greater number of human beings are never aware of what is passing around and within them, and millions fall victims of disease and die prematurely just on this account. The commonest, everyday occurrences appear to them mysterious and inexplicable. One may feel a sudden wave of sadness and rake his brain for an explanation when he might have noticed that it was caused by a cloud cutting off the rays of the sun. He may see the image of a friend dear to him under conditions which he construed as very peculiar, when only shortly before he has passed him in the street or seen his photograph somewhere. When he loses a collar button, he fusses and swears for an hour, being unable to visualize his previous actions and locate the object directly. deficient observation is merely a form of ignorance and responsible for the many morbid notions and foolish ideas prevailing. There is not more than 1 out of every 10 persons who does not believe in telepathy and other psychic manifestations, spiritualism and communion with the dead, and who would refuse to listen to willing or unwilling deceivers. Just to illustrate how deeply rooted this tendency has become even among the clear-headed American population, I may mention a comical incident. Psychic phenomena in the manufacture of flivvers. Shortly before the war, when the exhibition of my turbines in this city elicited widespread comment in the technical papers, I anticipated that there would be a scramble among manufacturers to get hold of the invention, and I had particular designs on that man from Detroit who has an uncanny faculty for accumulating millions. So confident was I that he would turn up some day that I declared this as certain to my secretary and assistants. Sure enough, one fine morning a body of engineers from the Ford Motor Company presented themselves with the request of discussing with me an important project. "Didn't I tell you?" I remarked triumphantly to my employees, and one of them said, "You are amazing, Mr. Tesla. Everything comes out exactly as you predict." As soon as these hard-headed men were seated, I, of course, immediately began to extol the wonderful features of my turbine, when the spokesman interrupted me and said, "We know all about this, but we are on a special errand. We have formed a psychological society for the investigation of psychic phenomena, and we want you to join us in this undertaking." I suppose those engineers never knew how near they came to being fired out of my office. Confuting Spiritism. Ever since I was told by some of the greatest men of the time, leaders in science whose names are immortal, that I am possessed of an unusual mind, I bent all my thinking faculties on the solution of great problems regardless of sacrifice. For many years I endeavored to solve the enigma of death, and watched eagerly for every kind of spiritual indication. But only once in the course of my existence have I had an experience which momentarily impressed me as supernatural. It was at the time of my mother's death. I had become completely exhausted by pain and long vigilance, and one night was carried to a building about 2 blocks from our home. As I lay helpless there, I thought that if my mother died while I was away from her bedside, she would surely give me a sign. 2 or 3 months before, I was in London in company with my late friend Sir William Crookes, when spiritualism was discussed, and I was under the full sway of these thoughts. I might not have paid attention to other men, but was susceptible to his arguments, as it was his epochal work on radiant matter, which I had read as a student, that made me embrace the electrical career. I reflected that the conditions for a look into the beyond were most favorable, for my mother was a woman of genius and particularly excelling in the powers of intuition. During the whole night every fibre in my brain was strained in expectancy, but nothing happened until early in the morning, when I fell in a sleep, or perhaps a swoon, and saw a cloud carrying angelic figures of marvellous beauty, one of whom gazed upon me lovingly and gradually assumed the features of my mother. The appearance slowly floated across the room and vanished, and I was awakened by an indescribably sweet song of many voices. In that instant a certitude which no words can impress came upon me that my mother had just died. And that was true. I was unable to understand the tremendous weight of the painful knowledge I received in advance, and wrote a letter to Sir William Crookes while still under the domination of these impressions and in poor bodily health. When I recovered, I sought for a long time the external cause of this strange manifestation, and, to my great relief, I succeeded after many months of fruitless effort. I had seen the painting of a celebrated artist, representing allegorically one of the seasons in the form of a cloud with a group of angels, which seemed to actually float in the air, and this had struck me forcefully. It was exactly the same that appeared in my dream, with the exception of my mother's likeness. The music came from the choir in the church nearby at the early Mass of Easter morning, explaining everything satisfactorily in conformity with scientific facts. This occurred long ago, and I have never had the faintest reason since to change my views on psychical and spiritual phenomena, for which there is absolutely no foundation. The belief in these is the natural outgrowth of intellectual development. Religious dogmas are no longer accepted in their orthodox meaning, but every individual clings to faith in a supreme power of some kind. We all must have an ideal to govern our conduct and ensure contentment, but it is immaterial whether it be one of creed, art, science, or anything else, so long as it fulfills the function of a dematerializing force. It is essential to the peaceful existence of humanity as a whole that one common conception should prevail. Tesla's astounding discovery. While I have failed to obtain any evidence in support of the contentions of psychologists and spiritualists, I have proved to my complete satisfaction the automatism of life, not only through continuous observations of individual actions, but even more conclusively through certain generalizations. These amount to a discovery which I consider of the greatest moment to human society, and on which I shall briefly dwell. I got the first inkling of this astounding truth when I was still a very young man, but for many years I interpreted what I noted simply as coincidences. Namely, whenever either myself, or a person to whom I was attached, or a cause to which I was devoted, was hurt by others in a particular way, which might be best properly characterized as the most unfair imaginable, I experienced a singular and undefinable pain, which, for want of a better term, I have qualified as cosmic, and shortly thereafter, and invariably, those who had inflicted it came to grief. After many such cases, I confided this to a number of friends, who had the opportunity to convince themselves of the truth of the theory which I have gradually formulated, and which may be stated in the following few words. Our bodies are of similar construction and exposed to the same external influences. This results in likeness of response and concordance of the general activities on which all our social and other rules and laws are based. We are automata entirely controlled by the forces of the medium, being tossed about like corks on the surface of the water, but mistaking the resultant of the impulses from the outside for free will. The movements and other actions we perform are always life-preservative, and though seemingly quite independent from one another, we are connected by invisible links. So long as the organism is in perfect order, it responds accurately to the agents that prompt it, but the moment that there is some derangement in any individual, his self-preservative power is impaired. Everybody understands, of course, that if one becomes deaf, has his eyesight weakened or his limbs injured, the chances for his continued existence are lessened. But this is also true, and perhaps more so, of certain defects in the brain, which deprive the automaton, more or less, of that vital quality and cause it to rush into destruction. A very sensitive and observant being, with his highly developed mechanism all intact, and acting with precision in obedience to the changing conditions of the environment, is endowed with a transcending mechanical sense, enabling him to evade perils too subtle to be directly perceived. When he comes in contact with others whose controlling organs are radically faulty, that sense asserts itself, and he feels the cosmic pain. The truth of this has been borne out in hundreds of instances, and I am inviting other students of nature to devote attention to this subject, believing that through combined and systematic effort, results of incalculable value to the world will be obtained. Dr. Tesla's first automaton. The idea of constructing an automaton to bear out my theory presented itself to me early, but I did not begin active work until 1893, when I started my wireless investigations. During the succeeding 2 or 3 years, a number of automatic mechanisms, to be actuated from a distance, were constructed by me and exhibited to visitors in my laboratory. In 1896, however, I designed a complete machine capable of a multitude of operations, but the consummation of my labors was delayed until late 1897. This machine was illustrated and described in my article in the Century magazine of June 1900 and other periodicals of that time, and, when first shown in the beginnings of 1898, it created a sensation such as no other invention of mine has ever produced. In November 1898, a basic patent on the novel art was granted to me, but only after the examiner-in-chief had come to New York and witnessed the performance, for what I claimed seemed unbelievable. I remember that when later I called on an official in Washington, with a view of offering the invention to the government, he burst out in laughter upon my telling him what I had accomplished. Nobody thought then that there was the faintest prospect of perfecting such a device. It is unfortunate that in this patent, following the advice of my attorneys, I indicated the control as being effected through the medium of a single circuit and a well-known form of detector, for the reason that I had not yet secured protection on my methods and apparatus for individualization. As a matter of fact, my boats were controlled through the joint action of several circuits, and interference of every kind was excluded. Most generally, I employed receiving circuits in the form of loops, including condensers, because the discharges of my high-tension transmitter ionizing the air in the hall, so that even a very small aerial would draw electricity from the surrounding atmosphere for hours. Just to give an idea, I found, for instance, that a bulb 12 inches in diameter, highly exhausted, and with one single terminal to which a short wire was attached, would deliver well onto 1,000 successive flashes before all charge of the air in the laboratory was neutralized. The loop form of receiver was not sensitive to such a disturbance, and it is curious to note that it is becoming popular at this late date. In reality, it collects much less energy than the aerials or a long-grounded wire, but it so happens that it does away with a number of defects inherent to the present wireless devices. In demonstrating my invention before audiences, the visitors were requested to ask any questions, however involved, and the automaton would answer them by signs. This was considered magic at that time, but was extremely simple, for it was myself who gave the replics by means of the device. At the same period, another larger telautomatic boat was constructed, a photograph of which is shown in this number of the Electrical Experimenter. It was controlled by loops, having several turns placed in the hull, which was made entirely watertight and capable of submergence. The apparatus was similar to that used in the first, with the exception of certain special features I introduced, as, for example, incandescent lamps which afforded a visible evidence of the proper functioning of the machine. Telautomatics of the future. These automata, controlled within the range of vision of the operator, were, however, the first and rather crude steps in the evolution of the art of telautomatics as I had conceived it. The next logical improvement was its application to automatic mechanisms beyond the limits of vision and at a great distance from the center of control, and I have ever since advocated their employment as instruments of warfare in preference to guns. The importance of this now seems to be recognized, if I am to judge from casual announcements through the press of achievements which are said to be extraordinary, but contain no merit of novelty whatever. In an imperfect manner it is practicable, with the existing wireless plants, to launch an aeroplane, have it follow a certain approximate course, and perform some operation at a distance of many hundreds of miles. A machine of this kind can also be mechanically controlled in several ways, and I have no doubt that it may prove of some usefulness in war. But there are, to my best knowledge, no instrumentalities in existence today with which such an object could be accomplished in a precise manner. I have devoted years of study to this matter, and have evolved means, making such and greater wonders easily realizable. As stated on a previous occasion, when I was a student at college, I conceived a flying machine quite unlike the present ones. The underlying principle was sound, but could not be carried into practice for want of a prime mover of sufficiently great activity. In recent years, I have successfully solved this problem, and I am now planning aerial machines devoid of sustaining planes, ailerons, propellers, and other external attachments, which will be capable of immense speeds and are very likely to furnish powerful arguments for peace in the near future. Such a machine, sustained and propelled entirely by reaction, is shown on one of the pages, and is supposed to be controlled either mechanically or by wireless energy. By installing proper plants, it will be practicable to project a missile of this kind into the air and drop it almost on the very spot designated, which may be thousands of miles away. But we are not going to stop at this. Telautomata will be ultimately produced, capable of acting as if possessed of their own intelligence, and their advent will create a revolution. As early as 1898, I proposed to representatives of a large manufacturing concern the construction and public exhibition of an automobile carriage, which, left to itself, would perform a great variety of operations, involving something akin to judgment. But my proposal was deemed chimerical at that time, and nothing came from it. At present, many of the ablest minds are trying to devise expedients for preventing a repetition of the awful conflict which is only theoretically ended, and the duration and main issues of which I have correctly predicted in an article printed in The Sun of December 20th, 1914. The proposed league is not a remedy, but, on the contrary, in the opinion of a number of competent men, may bring about results just the opposite. It is particularly regrettable that a punitive policy was adopted in framing the terms of peace, because a few years hence it will be possible for nations to fight without armies, ships, or guns, by weapons far more terrible, to the destructive action and range of which there is virtually no limit. Any city, at a distance whatsoever from the enemy, can be destroyed by him, and no power on earth can stop him from doing so. If we want to avert an impending calamity and a state of things which may transform this globe into an inferno, we should push the development of flying machines and wireless transmission of energy without an instant's delay, and with all the power and resources of the nation. End of section 6.
Section 7. Famous Scientific Illusions by Nikola Tesla. This article was published in Electrical Experimenter, February 1919. In this original and revolutionizing discussion, Nikola Tesla gives us something really new to think about. First, does the moon rotate on its axis? Second, is the Franklin pointed lightning rod correct in theory and operation? Third, do wireless signals fly through space by means of so-called Hertzian waves in the ether, or are they propagated through the earth at prodigious velocity by means of earth-bound oscillations? World-famous conundrums these, questions which have been answered in many ways by some of the greatest scientists. Dr. Tesla explains these three predominant scientific fallacies in a masterly way, so that everyone can understand them. The human brain, with all its wonderful capabilities and power, is far from being a faultless apparatus. Most of its parts may be in perfect working order, but some are atrophied, undeveloped, or missing altogether. Great men of all classes and professions, scientists, inventors, and hard-headed financiers, have placed themselves on record with impossible theories, inoperable devices, and unreliable schemes. It is doubtful that there could be found a single work of any one individual free of error. There is no such thing as an infallible brain. Invariably, some cells or fibers are wanting or unresponsive, with the result of impairing judgment, sense of proportion, or some other faculty. A man of genius eminently practical, whose name is a household word, has wasted the best years of his life in a visionary undertaking. A celebrated physicist was incapable of tracing the directions of an electric current according to a childishly simple rule. The writer, who was known to recite entire volumes by heart, has never been able to retain in memory and recapitulate in their proper order the words designating the colors of the rainbow, and can only ascertain them after long and laborious thought, strange as it may seem. Our organs of reception, too, are deficient and deceptive. As a semblance of life is produced by a rapid succession of inanimate pictures, so many of our perceptions are but trickery of the senses, devoid of reality. The greatest triumphs of man were those in which his mind had to free itself from the influence of delusive appearances. Such was the revelation of Buddha that self is an illusion caused by the persistence and continuity of mental images; the discovery of Copernicus that, contrary to all observation, this planet rotates around the sun; the recognition of Descartes that the human being is an automaton, governed by external influence, and the idea that the earth is spherical, which led Columbus to the finding of this continent. And though the minds of individuals supplement one another, and science and experience are continually eliminating fallacies and misconceptions, much of our present knowledge is still incomplete and unreliable. We have sophisms in mathematics which cannot be disproved. Even in pure reasoning, free of the shortcomings of symbolic processes, we are often arrested by doubt which the strongest intelligences have been unable to dispel. Experimental science itself, most positive of all, is not unfailing. In the following I shall consider 3 exceptionally interesting errors in the interpretation and application of physical phenomena which have for years dominated the minds of experts and men of science. 1. The illusion of the axial rotation of the moon. It is well known since the discovery of Galileo that the moon, in travelling through space, always turns the same face towards the earth. This is explained by saying that, while passing once around the mother planet, the lunar globe performs just one revolution on its axis. The spinning motion of a heavenly body must necessarily undergo modifications in the course of time, being either retarded by resistances internal or external, or accelerated owing to shrinkage and other causes. An unalterable rotational velocity through all phases of planetary evolution is manifestly impossible. What wonder, then, that at this very instant of its long existence our satellite should revolve exactly so, and not faster or slower? But many astronomers have accepted as physical fact that such rotation takes place. It does not, but only appears so. It is an illusion, a most surprising one, too. I will endeavor to make this clear by reference to Figure 1, in which E represents the Earth and M the Moon. The movement through space is such that the arrow, firmly attached to the latter, always occupies the position indicated with reference to the Earth. If one imagines himself as looking down on the orbital plane and follows the motion, he will become convinced that the moon does turn on its axis as it travels around. But in this very act the observer will have deceived himself. To make the delusion complete, let him take a washer similarly marked, and supporting it rotatably in the center, carry it around a stationary object, constantly keeping the arrow pointing towards the latter. Though to his bodily vision the disc will revolve on its axis, such movement does not exist. He can dispel the illusion at once by holding the washer fixedly while going around. He will now readily see that the supposed axial rotation is only apparent, an impression being produced by successive changes of position in space. But more convincing proofs can be given that the moon does not and cannot revolve on its axis. With this object in view, attention is called to Figure 2, in which both the satellite M and the earth E are shown embedded in a solid mass, M1, indicated by stippling, and supposed to rotate so as to impart to the moon its normal translatory velocity. Evidently, if the lunar globe could rotate as commonly believed, this would be equally true of any other portion of mass M1, as the sphere M2, shown in dotted lines, and then the part common to both bodies would have to turn simultaneously in opposite directions. This can be experimentally illustrated in the manner suggested by using instead of one, two overlapping rotatable washers, as may be conveniently represented by circles M and M2, and carrying them around a center as E, so that the plane and dotted arrows are always pointing towards the same center. No further argument is needed to demonstrate that the two gyrations cannot coexist, or even be pictured in the imagination and reconciled in a purely abstract sense. The truth is, the so-called axial rotation of the moon is a phenomenon deceptive alike to the eye and mind, and devoid of physical meaning. It has nothing in common with real mass revolution characterized by effects positive and unmistakable. Volumes have been written on the subject, and many erroneous arguments advanced in support of the notion. Thus it is reasoned that if the planet did not turn on its axis, it would expose the whole surface to terrestrial view. As only one half is visible, it must revolve. The first statement is true, but the logic of the second is defective, for it admits of only one alternative. The conclusion is not justified, as the same appearance can also be produced in another way. The moon does rotate, not on its own, but about an axis passing through the center of the earth, the true and only one. The unfailing test of the spinning of a mass is, however, the existence of energy of motion. The moon is not possessed of such vis viva. If it were the case, then a revolving body as M1 would contain mechanical energy other than that of which we have experimental evidence. Irrespective of this, so exact a coincidence between the axial and orbital periods is in itself immensely improbable, for this is not the permanent condition towards which the system is tending. Any axial rotation of a mass left to itself, retarded by forces external or internal, must cease. Even admitting its perfect control by tides, the coincidence would still be miraculous. But when we remember that most of the satellites exhibit this peculiarity, the probability becomes infinitesimal. 3 theories have been advanced for the origin of the moon. According to the oldest suggested by the great German philosopher Kant, and developed by Laplace in his monumental treatise Mécanique Céleste, the planets have been thrown off from larger central masses by centrifugal force. Nearly 40 years ago, Professor George H. Darwin, in a masterful essay on tidal friction, furnished mathematical proofs, deemed unrefutable, that the moon had separated from the earth. Recently this established theory has been attacked by Professor T.J.J. See in a remarkable work on the Evolution of the Stellar Systems, in which he propounds the view that centrifugal force was altogether inadequate to bring about the separation, and that all planets, including the moon, have come from the depths of space, and have been captured. Still a third hypothesis, of unknown origin, exists, which has been examined and commented upon by Professor W. H. Pickering in Popular Astronomy of 1907, and according to which the moon was torn from the earth when the latter was partially solidified, this accounting for the continents, which might not have been formed otherwise. Undoubtedly, planets and satellites have originated in both ways, and, in my opinion, it is not difficult to ascertain the character of their birth. The following conclusions can be safely drawn. 1. A heavenly body thrown off from a larger one cannot rotate on its axis. The mass, rendered fluid by the combined action of heat and pressure, upon the reduction of the latter, immediately stiffens, being at the same time deformed by gravitational pull. The the shape becomes permanent upon cooling and solidification, and the smaller mass continues to move about the larger one, as though it were rigidly connected to it, except for pendular swings or librations due to varying orbital velocity. Such motion precludes the possibility of axial rotation in the strictly physical sense. The moon has never spun around, as is well demonstrated by the fact that the most precise instruments have failed to show any measurable flattening in form. 2. If a planetary body in its orbital movement turns the same side towards the central mass, this is a positive proof that it has been separated from the latter and is a true satellite. 3. A planet revolving on its axis in its passage around another cannot have been thrown off from the same, but must have been captured. 2. The fallacy of Franklin's pointed lightning rod. The display of atmospheric electricity has since ages been one of the most marvelous spectacles afforded to the sight of man. Its grandeur and power filled him with fear and superstition. For centuries he attributed lightning to agents godlike and supernatural, and its purpose in the scheme of this universe remained unknown to him. Now we have learned that the waters of the ocean are raised by the sun and maintained in the atmosphere delicately suspended, that they are wafted to distant regions of the globe where electric forces assert themselves in upsetting the sensitive balance and causing precipitation, thus sustaining all organic life. There is every reason to hope that man will soon be able to control this life-giving flow of water and thereby solve many pressing problems of his existence. Atmospheric electricity became of special scientific interest in Franklin's time. Faraday had not yet announced his epochal discoveries in magnetic induction, but static frictional machines were already generally used in physical laboratories. Franklin's powerful mind at once leaped to the conclusion that frictional and atmospheric electricity were identical. To our present view, this inference seems obvious, but in his time the mere thought of it was little short of blasphemy. He investigated the phenomena and argued that if they were of the same nature, then the clouds would be drained of all their charge exactly as the ball of a static machine, and in 1749 he indicated in a published memoir how this could be done by the use of pointed metal rods. The earliest trials were made by Dallebrand in France, but Franklin himself was the first to obtain a spark by using a kite, in June 1752. When these atmospheric discharges manifest themselves today in our wireless station, we feel annoyed and wish that they would stop, but to the man who discovered them they brought tears of joy. The lightning conductor in its classical form was invented by Benjamin Franklin in 1755, and immediately upon its adoption proved a success to a degree. As usual, however, its virtues were often exaggerated. So, for instance, it was seriously claimed that in the city of Pietermaritzburg, capital of Natal, South Africa, no lightning strikes occurred after the pointed rods were installed, although the storms were as frequent as before. Experience has shown that just the opposite is true. A modern city like New York, presenting innumerable sharp points and projections in good contact with the earth, is struck much more often than equivalent area of land. Statistical records, carefully compiled and published from time to time, demonstrate that the danger from lightning to property and life has been reduced to a small percentage by Franklin's invention, but the damage by fire amounts nevertheless to several $1,000,000 annually. It is astonishing that this device, which has been in universal use for more than 1 century and a half, should be found to involve a gross fallacy in design and construction, which impairs its usefulness, and may even render its employment hazardous under certain conditions. For explanation of this curious fact, I may first refer to Figure 3, in which S is a metallic sphere of radius r, such as the capacity terminal of a static machine, provided with a sharply pointed pin of length h as indicated. It is well known that the latter has the property of quickly dissipating the accumulated charge into the air. To examine this action in the light of present knowledge, we may liken electric potential to temperature. Imagine that sphere S is heated to T degrees, and that the pin or metal bar is a perfect conductor of heat, so that its extreme end is at the same temperature T. Then, if another sphere of larger radius, V1, is drawn about the first, and the temperature along this boundary is T1, it is evident that there will be between the end of the bar and its surrounding a difference of temperature, T minus T1, which will determine the outflow of heat. Obviously, if the adjacent medium was not affected by the hot sphere, this temperature difference would be greater and more heat would be given off. Exactly so in the electric system. Let Q be the quantity of the charge, then the sphere, and owing to its great conductivity also the pin, will be at the potential Q divided by R. The medium around the point of the pin will be at the potential Q divided by R1 equals Q divided by the sum R plus H, and consequently the difference Q divided by R minus Q divided by the sum R plus H equals QH divided by the quantity R times the sum of R plus H. Suppose now that a sphere S of much larger radius, capital R equals lowercase nr, is employed containing a charge uppercase Q. This difference of potential will be, analogously, capital QH divided by the product capital R times the sum capital R plus H. According to elementary principles of electrostatics, the potentials of the two spheres, lowercase s and uppercase s, will be equal if uppercase Q equals lowercase nq, in which case capital QH divided by the product capital R times the sum capital R plus H equals the product lowercase nqh divided by the product lowercase nr times the sum nr plus h equals lowercase qh divided by the product lowercase r times the sum nr plus h. Thus the difference of potential between the point of the pin and the medium around the same will be smaller in the ratio r plus h divided by nr plus h when the large sphere is used. In many scientific tests and experiments, this important observation has been disregarded with the result of causing serious errors. Its significance is that the behavior of the pointed rod entirely depends on the linear dimensions of the electrified body. Its quality to give off the charge may be entirely lost if the latter is very large. For this reason, all points or projections on the surface of a conductor of such vast dimensions as the earth would be quite ineffective were it not for other influences. These will be elucidated with reference to Figure 4, in which our artist of the Impressionist school has emphasized Franklin's notion that his rod was drawing electricity from the clouds. If the earth were not surrounded by an atmosphere which is generally oppositely charged, it would behave, despite all its irregularities of surface, like a polished sphere. But owing to the electrified masses of air and cloud, the distribution is greatly modified. Thus in Figure 4, the positive charge of the cloud induces in the earth an equivalent opposite charge, the density at the surface of the latter diminishing with the cube of the distance from the static center of the cloud. A brush discharge is then formed at the point of the rod, and the action Franklin anticipated takes place. In addition, the surrounding air is ionized and rendered conducting, and eventually a bolt may hit the building or some other object in the vicinity. The virtue of the pointed end to dissipate the charge, which was uppermost in Franklin's mind, is, however, infinitesimal. Careful measurements show that it would take many years before the electricity stored in a single cloud of moderate size would be drawn off or neutralized through such a lightning conductor. The grounded rod has the quality of rendering harmless most of the strokes it receives, though occasionally the charge is diverted with damaging results. But, what is very important to note, it invites danger and hazard on account of the fallacy involved in its design. The sharp point, which was thought advantageous and indispensable to its operation, is really a defect, detracting considerably from the practical value of the device. I have produced a much improved form of lightning protector, characterized by the employment of a terminal of considerable area and large radius of curvature, which makes impossible undue density of the charge and ionization of the air. Footnote: Refer to the October 1918 issue of this journal, wherein Dr. Tesla's new form of non-pointed lightning rod was fully described and illustrated. End footnote. These protectors act as quasi-repellents, and so far have never been struck, though exposed a long time. Their safety is experimentally demonstrated to greatly exceed that invented by Franklin. By their use, property worth millions of dollars which is now annually lost can be saved. 3. The singular misconception of the wireless. To the popular mind this sensational advance conveys the impression of a single invention, but in reality it is an art, the successful practice of which involves the employment of a great many discoveries and improvements. I viewed it as such when I undertook to solve wireless problems, and it is due to this fact that my insight into its underlying principles was clear from their very inception. In the course of development of my induction motors, it became desirable to operate them at high speeds, and for this purpose I constructed alternators of relatively high frequencies. The striking behavior of the currents soon captivated my attention, and in 1889 I started a systematic investigation of their properties and the possibilities of practical application. The first gratifying result of my efforts in this direction was the transmission of electrical energy through one wire without return, of which I gave demonstrations in my lectures and addresses before several scientific bodies, here and abroad, in 1891 and 1892. During that period, while working with my oscillation transformers and dynamos of frequencies up to 200,000 cycles per second, the idea gradually took hold of me that the earth might be used in place of the wire, thus dispensing with artificial conductors altogether. The immensity of the globe seemed an unsurmountable obstacle, but after a prolonged study of the subject, I became satisfied that the undertaking was rational, and in my lectures before the Franklin Institute and National Electric Light Association early in 1893, I gave the outline of the system I had conceived. In the latter part of that year, at the Chicago World's Fair, I had the good fortune of meeting Professor Helmholtz, to whom I explained my plan, illustrating it with experiments. On that occasion I asked the celebrated physicist for an expression of opinion on the feasibility of the scheme. He stated unhesitatingly that it was practicable, provided I could perfect apparatus capable of putting it into effect, but this, he anticipated, would be extremely difficult to accomplish. I resumed the work very much encouraged, and from that date to 1896 advanced slowly but steadily, making a number of improvements, the chief of which was my system of concatenated tuned circuits, and method of regulation, now universally adopted. In the summer of 1897, Lord Kelvin happened to pass through New York, and honored me by a visit to my laboratory, where I entertained him with demonstrations in support of my wireless theory. He was fairly carried away with what he saw, but, nevertheless, condemned my project in emphatic terms, qualifying it as something impossible, an illusion and a snare. I had expected his approval, and was pained and surprised. But the next day he returned, and gave me a better opportunity for explanation of the advances I had made, and of the true principles underlying the system I had evolved. Suddenly he remarked with evident astonishment, "Then you are not making use of Hertz waves?" "Certainly not," I replied. "These are radiations. No energy could be economically transmitted to a distance by any such agency. In my system the process is one of true conduction, which, theoretically, can be effected at the greatest distance without appreciable loss." I can never forget the magic change that came over the illustrious philosopher the moment he freed himself from that erroneous impression. The skeptic, who would not believe, was suddenly transformed into the warmest of supporters. He parted from me not only thoroughly convinced of the scientific soundness of the idea, but strongly expressed his confidence in its success. In my exposition to him, I resorted to the following mechanical analogues of my own and the Hertz wave system. Imagine the earth to be a bag of rubber filled with water, a small quantity of which is periodically forced in and out of the same by means of a reciprocating pump, as illustrated. If the strokes of the latter are effected in intervals of more than 1 hour and 48 minutes, sufficient for the transmission of the impulse through the whole mass, the entire bag will expand and contract, and corresponding movements will be imparted to pressure gauges or movable pistons with the same intensity, irrespective of distance. By working the pump faster, shorter waves will be produced, which, on reaching the opposite end of the bag, may be reflected and give rise to stationary nodes and loops. But in any case, the fluid being incompressible, its enclosure perfectly elastic, and the frequency of oscillations not very high, the energy will be economically transmitted, and very little power consumed, so long as no work is done in the receivers. This is a crude but correct representation of my wireless system, in which, however, I resort to various refinements. Thus, for instance, the pump is made part of a resonant system of great inertia, enormously magnifying the force of the impressed pulses. The receiving devices are similarly conditioned, and in this manner the amount of energy collected in them vastly increased. The Hertz wave system is in many respects the very opposite of this. To explain it by analogy, the piston of the pump is assumed to vibrate to and fro at a terrific rate, and the orifice through which the fluid passes in and out of the cylinder is reduced to a small hole. There is scarcely any movement of the fluid, and almost the whole work performed results in the production of radiant heat, of which an infinitesimal part is recovered in a remote locality. However incredible, it is true that the minds of some of the ablest experts have been from the beginning, and still are, obsessed by this monstrous idea, and so it comes that the true wireless art, to which I laid the foundation in 1893, has been retarded in its development for 20 years. This is the reason why the statics have proved unconquerable, why the wireless shares are of little value, and why the government has been compelled to interfere. We are living on a planet of well nigh inconceivable dimensions, surrounded by a layer of insulating air, above which is a rarefied and conducting atmosphere, Fig. 5. This is providential, for if all the air were conducting, the transmission of electrical energy through the natural media would be impossible. My early experiments have shown that currents of high frequency and great tension readily pass through an atmosphere but moderately rarefied, so that the insulating stratum is reduced to a small thickness, as will be evident by inspection of Fig. 6, in which a part of the earth and its gaseous envelope is shown to scale. If the radius of the sphere is 12½ inches, then the non-conducting layer is only 1/64 of an inch thick, and it will be obvious that the Hertzian rays cannot traverse so thin a crack between two conducting surfaces for any considerable distance without being absorbed. The theory has been seriously advanced that these radiations pass around the globe by successive reflections, But to show the absurdity of this suggestion, reference is made to Figure 7, in which this process is diagrammatically indicated. Assuming that there is no refraction, the rays, as shown on the right, would travel along the sides of a polygon drawn around the solid, and inscribed into the conducting gaseous boundary, in which case the length of the side would be about 400 miles. As 1/2 the circumference of the earth is approximately 12,000 miles long, there will be, roughly, 30 deviations. The efficiency of such a reflector cannot be more than 25%, so that if none of the energy of the transmitter were lost in other ways, the part recovered would be measured by the fraction 1/4 to the 30th power. Let the transmitter radiate Hertz waves at the rate of 1,000 kilowatts. Then 115 billionth part of 1 watt is all that would be collected in a perfect receiver. In truth, the reflections would be much more numerous, as shown on the left of the figure, and owing to this and other reasons, on which it is unnecessary to dwell, the amount recovered would be a vanishing quantity. Consider now the process taking place in the transmission by the instrumentalities and methods of my invention. For this purpose attention is called to Figure 8, which gives an idea of the mode of propagation of the current waves and is largely self-explanatory. The drawing represents a solar eclipse, with the shadow of the moon just touching the surface of the earth at a point where the transmitter is located. As the shadow moves downward, it will spread over the earth's surface, first with infinite and then gradually diminishing velocity, until at a distance of about 6,000 miles, it will attain its true speed in space. From there on it will proceed with increasing velocity, reaching infinite value at the opposite point of the globe. It hardly need be stated that this is merely an illustration, and not an accurate representation in the astronomical sense. The exact law will be readily understood by reference to Figure 9, in which a transmitting circuit is shown connected to earth and to an antenna. The transmitter being in action, two effects are produced. Hertz waves pass through the air, and a current traverses the earth. The former propagate with the speed of light, and their energy is unrecoverable in the circuit. The latter proceeds with the speed varying as the cosecant of the angle which a radius drawn from any point under consideration forms with the axis of symmetry of the waves. At the origin the speed is infinite, but gradually diminishes until a quadrant is traversed, then the velocity is that of light. From there on it again increases, becoming infinite at the antipole. Theoretically, the energy of this current is recoverable in its entirety, in properly attuned receivers. Some experts, whom I have credited with better knowledge, have for years contended that my proposals to transmit power without wires are sheer nonsense, but I note that they are growing more cautious every day. The latest objection to my system is found in the cheapness of gasoline. These men labor under the impression that the energy flows in all directions, and that, therefore, only a minute amount can be recovered in any individual receiver. But this is by far from being so. The power is conveyed in only one direction, from the transmitter to the receiver, and none of it is lost elsewhere. It is perfectly practicable to recover at any point of the globe energy enough for driving an airplane, or a pleasure boat, or for lighting a dwelling. I am especially sanguine in regard to the lighting of isolated places, and believe that a more economical and convenient method can hardly be devised. The future will show whether my foresight is as accurate now as it has proved heretofore. End of Section 7.
Section 8. Tesla's Egg of Columbus by Nikola Tesla. This article was published in Electrical Experimenter, March 1919. Tesla's Egg of Columbus. How Tesla performed the feat of Columbus without cracking the egg. Probably one of the most far-reaching and revolutionary discoveries made by Mr. Tesla is the so-called rotating magnetic field. This is a new and wonderful manifestation of force, a magnetic cyclone, producing striking phenomena which amazed the world when they were first shown by him. It results from the joint action of two or more alternating currents definitely related to one another, and creating magnetic fluxes, which, by their periodic rise and fall according to a mathematical law, cause a continuous shifting of the lines of force. There is a vast difference between an ordinary electromagnet and that invented by Tesla. In the former the lines are stationary. In the latter they are made to whirl around at a furious rate. The first attracts a piece of iron and holds it fast. The second causes it to spin in any direction and with any speed desired. Long ago, when Tesla was still a student, he conceived the idea of the rotating magnetic field, and this remarkable principle is embodied in his famous induction motor and system of transmission of power now in universal use. In this issue of the Electrical Experimenter, Mr. Tesla gives a remarkable account of his early efforts and trials as an inventor, and of his final success. Unlike other technical advances, arrived at through the usual hit-and-miss methods and haphazard experimentation, the rotating field was purely the work of scientific imagination. Tesla developed and perfected, entirely in his mind, this great idea in all its details and applications, without making one single experiment. Not even the usual first model was used. When the various forms of apparatus he had devised were tried for the first time, they worked exactly as he had imagined, and he took out some 40 fundamental patents covering the whole vast region he had explored. He obtained the first rotations in the summer of 1883, after 5 years of constant and intense thought on the subject, and then undertook the equally difficult task of finding believers in his discovery. The alternating current was but imperfectly understood, and had no standing with engineers or electricians, and for a long time Tesla talked to deaf ears. But ultimately his pains were rewarded, and early in 1887 a company bearing his name was formed for the commercial introduction of the invention. Dr. Tesla recently told the editors an amusing incident in this connection. He had approached a Wall Street capitalist, a prominent lawyer, with a view of getting financial support, and this gentleman called in a friend of his, a well-known engineer at the head of one of the big corporations in New York, to pass upon the merits of the scheme. This man was a practical expert, who knew of the failures in the industrial exploitation of alternating currents, and was distinctly prejudiced to a point of not caring even to witness some tests. After several discouraging conferences, Mr. Tesla had an inspiration. Everybody has heard of the egg of Columbus. The saying goes that at a certain dinner the great explorer asked some scoffers of his project to balance an egg on its end. They tried it in vain. He then took it, and cracking the shell slightly by a gentle blow, made it stand upright. This may be a myth, but the fact is that he was granted an audience by Isabella, the Queen of Spain, and won her support. There is a suspicion that she was more impressed by his portly bearing than the prospect of his discovery. Whatever it might have been, the Queen pawned her jewels, and 3 ships were equipped for him, and so it happened that the Germans got all that was coming to them in this war. But to return to Tesla's reminiscence. He said to these men, "Do you know the story of the egg of Columbus?" Of course they did. "Well," he continued, "what if I could make an egg stand on the pointed end without cracking the shell?" "If you could do this, we would admit that you had gone Columbus one better." "And would you be willing to go out of your way as much as Isabella?" "We have no crown jewels to pawn," said the lawyer, who was a wit. "But there are a few ducats in our buckskins, and we might help you to an extent." Mr. Tesla thus succeeded in capturing the attention and personal interest of these very busy men, extremely conservative and reluctant to go into any new enterprise, and the rest was easy. He arranged for a demonstration the following day. A rotating field magnet was fastened under the top board of a wooden table, and Mr. Tesla provided a copper-plated egg and several brass balls and pivoted iron discs for convincing his prospective associates. He placed the egg on the table, and to their astonishment it stood on end. But when they found that it was rapidly spinning, their stupefaction was complete. The brass balls and pivoted iron discs in turn were set spinning rapidly by the rotating field, to the amazement of the spectators. No sooner had they regained their composure than Tesla was delighted with the question, "Do you want any money?" "Columbus was never in a worse predicament," said the great inventor, who had parted with his last portrait of George Washington in defraying the expenses of the preparation. Before the meeting adjourned, he had a substantial check in his pocket, and it was given with the assurance that there was more to be had in the same bank. That started the ball rolling. Tens of millions of horsepower of Tesla's induction motors are now in use all over the world, and their production is rising like a flood. In 1893, Mr. Albert Schmid, then superintendent of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, constructed a powerful rotating field ring with an egg made of copper, and larger than that of an ostrich, for Dr. Tesla's personal collection at the Chicago World's Fair. This piece of apparatus was one of the most attractive novelties ever publicly shown, and drew enormous crowds every day. Subsequently, it was taken to Mr. Tesla's laboratory, and served there permanently for demonstrating rotating field phenomena. In his experiments, it was practicable to use as much as 200 horsepower for a short time, without overheating the wires, and the effects of the magnetic forces were wonderfully fascinating to observe. This is the very ring indicated in the accompanying photograph, Figure 1, giving a view of Mr. Tesla's former laboratory at 46 East Houston Street, New York. It is shown in detail in Figure 2, and the mode of winding is illustrated in diagram, Figure 3. Originally, the two-phase arrangement was provided, but Mr. Tesla transformed it to the 3- and 4-phase when desired. On top of the ring was fastened a thin circular board, slightly hollowed, and provided around its circumference with a guard to prevent the objects from flying off. Even more interesting than the spinning egg was the exhibition of planetary motion. In this experiment, one large and several small brass balls were usually employed. When the field was energized, all the balls would be set spinning, the large one remaining in the center, while the small ones revolved around it, like moons about a planet, gradually receding until they reached the outer guard, and raced along the same. But the demonstration which most impressed the audiences was the simultaneous operation of numerous balls, pivoted discs, and other devices placed in all sorts of positions, and at considerable distances from the rotating field. When the currents were turned on, and the whole animated with motion, it presented an unforgettable spectacle. Mr. Tesla had many vacuum bulbs, in which small, light metal discs were pivotally arranged on jewels, and these would spin anywhere in the hall when the iron ring was energized. Rotating fields of 15,000 horsepower are now being turned out by the leading manufacturers, and it is very likely that in the near future capacities of 50,000 horsepower will be employed in the steel and other industries and ship propulsion by Tesla's electric drive, which, according to Secretary of the Navy Daniels' statement, has proved a great success. But any student interested in these phenomena can repeat all the classical experiments of Tesla by inexpensive apparatus. For this purpose, it is only necessary to make 2 slip-ring connections on an ordinary small direct current motor or dynamo, and to wind an iron ring with 4 coils, as indicated in diagram Figure 3. No particular rule need be given for the windings, but it may be stated that he will get the best results if he will use an iron ring of comparatively small section, and wind it with as many turns of stout wire as practicable. He can heavily copper plate an egg, but he should bear in mind that Tesla's egg is not as innocent as that of Columbus. The worst that can happen with the latter is that it might be, overripe, but the Tesla egg may explode with disastrous effect, because the copper plating is apt to be brought to a high temperature through the induced currents. The sensible experimenter will therefore first suck out the contents of the egg, thus satisfying both his appetite and thirst for knowledge. Besides the rotating field apparatus, Mr. Tesla had other surprises for his audiences, which were even more wonderful. So, for instance, the coil on 3 legs, visible in the foreground, was used to operate wireless motors, lamps, and other devices, and the spiral coil in the background served to show extraordinary high potential phenomena as streamers of great length. End of section 8.
Section 9 of Tesla on High-Frequency Generators by Nikola Tesla. This article was published in Electrical Experimenter, April 1919. Editor, Electrical Experimenter. It is to be regretted that a letter addressed to me by Mr. J. Harris Rogers, in your care, was published in the March number of the Electrical Experimenter. Although the concurrence of our views in some wireless features might have made this desirable to so wide-awake and enterprising a periodical as yours. Mr. Rogers seems to be a very appreciative gentleman, and nothing would be farther from my thoughts than to detract anything from his merit. But in a separate contribution which I expect to prepare for your next issue, I shall express myself on this subject without prejudice and in the interest of truth. However, the article by your Mr. H. Winfield Secor on America's Greatest War Invention, the Rogers Underground Wireless, contains a reference to a novel and original high-frequency generator of Mr. Rogers' invention. May I not, to use the President's elegant expression, call attention to the fact that this device was described by me years ago, as will be evident from the following excerpt of a communication which appeared in the Electrical Review of March 15, 1899. In speaking of circuit controllers, I said, I may mention here, based on a different principle, which is incomparably more effective, more efficient, and also simpler on the whole. It comprises a fine stream of conducting fluid, which is made to issue, with any desired speed, from an orifice connected with one pole of a generator, through the primary of the induction coil, against the other terminal of the generator placed at a small distance. This device gives discharges of remarkable suddenness, and the frequency may be brought within reasonable limits, almost to anything desired. I have used this device for a long time in connection with ordinary coils, and in a form of my own coil, with results greatly superior in every respect to those obtainable with the form of your letter. Make a few statements referring to such make-and-break devices in general, and various forms based on this new principle. I may add that a great many forms of this apparatus were constructed and employed by me for a long time, proving very convenient and useful. Water does not give particularly good results, being incapable of causing very abrupt changes, but electrolytes have the property of diminishing enormously in resistance when they are heated, and the effects are much more intense. Salts of lithium are especially efficient. Nikola Tesla, New York, February 20th, 1919. End of section 9.